Welcome to our Facebook Live tonight with our guest, Randy Adams. This is for our SBC 21 Presidential Nominees Facebook group. And so we hope that you will gain a lot of insight into Randy Adams tonight and learn a little bit more about him and what he stands for and what he'd like to do in our convention. So let me bring Randy on. Randy is the Executive Director for the Northwest Baptist Convention. And Randy, we are delighted to have you with us tonight.
Good to be with you, Bobby. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we're glad that you took the time out to be able to talk to us tonight. What we're going to do, Randy, and to all of our viewers, we're going to, for a few minutes, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to interview you with some of the questions that we've already seen. As the Northwest Executive Director, or Northwest Baptist Convention Executive Director, you've been leading in the denomination, and prior to that were on staff with the Baptist Convention in Oklahoma as well. And I want to jump right in and ask you a few questions that have kind of surfaced, and some things that you've already been talking about and kind of bringing to the surface yourself. So let me ask you to do this. You've publicly made this statement that the GCR was the worst decision Southern Baptists have made in several decades. At the core, why would you make such a statement about this change of direction, I guess you could say?
Well, I was very concerned when the GCR was first presented. I was at the convention in Orlando when we discussed it and voted on it, and I voted against it at that time. I also wrote against it. I actually wrote an article when I was in Oklahoma in favor of the state convention, or in support of the way we cooperate both at the associational level and at the state convention level, making the argument that state conventions are not in this only for themselves, just as our churches are not, but that we have impact on the kingdom beyond. For example, I became a Southern Baptist. I was saved as a young child, but I'm from Montana. I became a Baptist through collegiate ministry at Montana Tech in Butte, Montana. And that collegiate ministry was supported through the state convention. It was the only Christian group on campus. And it's where I learned to love the Bible. It's where I read the Bible through for the very first time. And I was a petroleum engineering major and got my degree in that. But my senior year really felt the call to preach, and that was largely through the work of the state convention. So I think the GCR, what it did was it made mission work in North America top down instead of bottom up, or instead of church up. I think everything should start with the local church. And the people who are closest to the local church at the denominational level are the associational missionaries. In fact, in Montana and in the Northwest where I now serve, and throughout the country largely, it's the associational missionary that represents Southern Baptist. Even my first two pastorates in Texas, the only denominational person I personally knew was the associational missionary. And through the GCR, associations have been completely defunded outside of the South. And for example, I have 2.5 states in our convention. We only have one full-time associational missionary. That's true for much of the non-South. So the GCR made things top down, and the North American Mission Board has largely taken control as much as they can of church planting and directed it from a national office. Interestingly and tragically, I would say, we have seen nothing but decline since the GCR. The GCR stands for Great Commission Resurgence. I call it the Great Commission Regression, because instead of resurging, or instead of growing in our Great Commission effectiveness, we've gone backwards. We baptize far fewer people today, over 100,000 fewer than we did 10 years ago. We're at the 1938 level as of 2019. Church plants, likewise, we're planting less than half the churches. We're even planting hundreds fewer than we did 5 or 6 years ago. Cooperative program giving is at a low that we haven't seen in probably 25 years. And I think the Great Commission Resurgence put us on a downward path instead of an upward path. And it's really harmed us greatly. And I think the statistics bear that out. You know, it could be theoretical in 2010 when we voted. We could debate the theory of it. But these 10 years have shown us that did not work.
Yeah, it appears to be a failed strategy just by raw numbers, not, and there are other evidences as well. Well, let me ask you this. The GCR documents and the recordings of the meetings of that task force, the GCR task force, they were sealed. They were sealed for 10 years initially and then 15 years. And oddly enough, many of the people who are now in leadership positions across our convention were people who served on that GCR task force at that time. Now, some have been suspicious that those documents would reveal something that might be very damaging, and those individuals didn't want to be incriminated. I know I've heard the argument that, well, there's some confidentiality, and I understand that to a point. But
there are all kinds of issues that we could address, specific issues, but we need transparency in how we do our work. And the GCR task force, the minutes being sealed for 15 years, we can't even look at what the discussions were about. To me, that's a lack of transparency. We need to know. It used to be that we believed, trust the Lord and tell the people. And I think we need to get back to that. Through transparency, financial transparency, performance transparency. We shouldn't have so many closed meetings, and the GCR records should be unsealed. And accountability. Transparency builds trust. Accountability is corruption. Without transparency, you don't have trust, and you can therefore have corruption if people cannot see the decisions that are being made or see how the money's being spent. Accountability stops corruption. And then we need to expand participation to all of our churches. I mean, the churches are what the convention exists for, and it's tragic, I think, that so few churches can participate in the annual meeting of the SBC because it's very costly. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. I believe we should expand participation. Our theory and theme ought to be every church every year, making the decisions that affect the cooperative work of our churches. So essentially, that's what I'm running on, is transforming the way we do our work. And I believe that through transparency, not only will we unlock the GCR records, but we'll open up the books. I'm the candidate for opening up the bank books so that we know specifically how money is being spent.
Well, Randy, that kind of takes us to something else you've spoken publicly about. Maybe you can unpack this a little bit more. You've talked about now within the Southern Baptist Convention, it's come to light that there's a lot of self-dealing, favoritism among maybe even just kind of an elite group within the Southern Baptist Convention. Expound on that some. Explain for us.
Well, the most egregious example that we know of most recently was the former president of Lifeway. When he exited Lifeway to run the company that he founded while he was president of Lifeway, he was given a compensation agreement in excess of $1 million, over $1 million plus benefits, as we understand. That compensation agreement was signed off by the chairman of Lifeway's board. He did not reveal, this is a past chairman of Lifeway's board, he did not reveal that decision or discuss that decision with the compensation committee of the board, nor with the executive committee of the board. The trustee chairman of his own authority and one vice president of Lifeway signed off on a compensation agreement in excess of $1 million. Now, that kind of self-dealing is just wrong on its face. But the other thing is that same trustee chairman signed 3 book contracts with Lifeway, which is in violation of the SBC bylaws, that you cannot receive direct or indirect compensation when you're serving as a trustee of an agency. He signed 3 book deals, and he's still a Lifeway trustee. Not only that, but another one of our entities, the North American Mission Board, actually purchases copies of some of his books and gives them away. So there's a lot of way that self-dealing can happen and does happen in the Southern Baptist Convention. If you get in the right position and write a book, your book could then be distributed by one of our entities enriching you, and that appears as what has happened at Lifeway. And we don't know what's happened in other places because of the lack of transparency. We accidentally discovered that because Lifeway sued their former president. And had they not sued him, we would never have known about the $1 million compensation agreement.
Yeah, and I was going to follow up with that because that sounds like it could be an isolated situation, but you also addressed issues within our trustee system that there are other things that have surfaced. I mean, several of the things I know that have just, well, they've been fluttering across social media here just in the last few weeks. Things like the North American Mission Board funding church plants that had women pastors serving on their staff. One of the churches that had a beer label created after them, their name, and they went to beer festivals and that kind of thing, and actually had beer and Bible study, if I remember reading that correctly. But what can you tell us about this? Is this a trustee failure? Is it a failure in top leadership? Is it because some, and I'm rambling, but let me come back. Some of what you just said about the situation with Dr. Rayner and the situation at Lifeway, to me, I think some of those things are in conflict with the actual SBC bylaws as far as the self-healing and you can't benefit from and that kind of thing.
Yeah, they are. When we speak of financial transparency, for example, NAMB last year reported that they spent $69 million on church planting. But that's all we know. We don't know how those $69 million were applied. We don't know, for example, how total churches are being funded by NAMB right now. How many checks went out last month to how many church plants? We don't know. Recently, Joe Westbury, a reporter, asked for that information, and he said, can you tell me how many churches are funded per state? And they wouldn't give him that information. I believe that Southern Baptists have a right to know. Our churches that send in their mission dollars have a right to know how many church plants are we funding, because the fewest number of church plants in at least 40 years was 2019, prior to COVID. COVID would be lower still. 552 churches in 2019, but many of those were not funded by NAMB. We don't know how many were funded by NAMB. And then, if we had a list, if we knew which churches were being funded by NAMB, because increasingly they're not funded through the state convention. So the state convention doesn't necessarily know. They're funded through their partnering church. If we knew that, and if associations knew that, it might be that we could catch some of these problems with women pastors, with churches that have breweries, and that church that you referred to actually has a brewery, and the church is no longer funded as a church plant. They've gone off funding, but they've been a very important church plant in terms of training church planters. They've been an assessment center for NAMB, a training center for NAMB, and they run a brewery, and they have a female teaching pastor. That was recently. It was only discovered about 3 weeks ago, probably. And we just don't know how many other churches there are like that, because there's a lack of transparency. We don't know who's getting the grants, for example. The $69 million, how is that distributed? We just don't know. And to me, secrecy has no place in terms of how we spend our money. Our churches that give the money have a right to know how the money's being spent. And I think if you're proud of what you're accomplishing, you would have no problem telling us how you're spending the money, and you'd have no problem telling us how many churches are being funded and where those churches are located. And so if you're not willing to tell us that, it tells me perhaps there's something that you don't want people to know. And that should never be the case in Baptist life. Trust the Lord, tell the people.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right, Randy. And you've been a church planter, you've been a pastor for many years, just as I have. And I look back at the churches where I've served, even as an interim or a transitional pastor. Anybody in the church that wants to know that they're giving, but they know what I made, as the pastor. They knew what my compensation package was. You would think that you would want that kind of transparency out of our entities. Is the kind of I hate to use the word secrecy, but maybe when you're talking about transparency, secrecy is the right word. Is the kind of secrecy that's hiding, for instance, that one huge sum that's identified as church planting, but we don't know if it's buying houses, if it's doing we don't know what it's doing, right?
Right.
Is that common among large, nonprofit type organizations, religious organizations? Do most of them hide, what they're doing as far as the budgeting of money and what their employees, especially their top executives, make?
I think it's not common. For example, Samaritan's Purse has a rating, a Better Business Bureau rating for a charity. They have a charitable rating because they're financially transparent. The North American Mission Board does not have a charitable rating with the Better Business Bureau because they're not financially transparent. There's not enough that's been revealed in terms of how they budget and how they spend that they're able to receive a charitable rating. Now get this. Not only does NAMB not have a charitable rating because of their lack of financial transparency, Planned Parenthood, whom we loathe, they have a charitable rating because they are more transparent in how they spend their money and the salaries of their executives than the North American Mission Board is. Now, let me be clear. Planned Parenthood is under legal obligation to have financial transparency. North American Mission Board has no legal obligation to do that, but I would think they have a moral and an ethical obligation to Southern Baptists to be at least as financially transparent as Planned Parenthood or Samaritan's Purse or many other charities. Now, one reason and one way in Southern Baptist life our entities can get away with that lack of transparency is they don't solicit in the traditional fashion individual donors. So Samaritan's Purse is going after donors, and a lot of charities are. We fund our work cooperatively for the most part, and it's the churches that fund the work. The churches send the money. The churches gather the money. The churches send the money, and so therefore the financial transparency really. Churches ought to be demanding that. Individual donors don't think about that. Southern Baptists aren't specifically sending checks to fund our entities other than the mission offerings that we do, the couple of mission offerings. But our churches do send those funds. I think our churches have a right to know how that money's being spent. And we ought to be transparent, at least as transparent as Planned Parenthood and Samaritan's Purse and World Vision and some of these other charitable organizations.
You've talked about transparency quite a bit, and you've written a number of articles. Give us your website again so people can go and look, because you have a number of articles where you've talked about some of these things in more detail.
Right. It's randyadams.org. And the reason I've written about these things in detail, I believe Southern Baptists have a right to know what the president intends to do. And I've said, I don't have the name recognition of some others. And therefore, if people vote for me, they vote for the message. And it gives me a mandate. If Southern Baptists want transparency, if they want increased accountability, if they want their churches empowered through participation, then a vote for me, there's only one reason that I'll win and can win, and that is if people want to see transformation, if they want to see change, if they want to see transparency. I don't hear others talking specifically about the need for transparency and giving specific examples, or the need for accountability and giving specific examples. So that's why I lay these things out. And I think it's only right that Southern Baptists know. I would never ask anyone to vote for me if they didn't know what I believed and didn't know what I intend to do if I'm elected.
Right. Well, one of the things, kind of where I was going with that, was one of the things you've revealed in some of those writings, and I've heard you say it in some of the podcasts and other things where you've been interviewed. You brought up that Southern Baptists now, across a lot of our entities, have started using non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. Mm-hmm. And in past history, prior to the passing of the GCR, I'm not aware that most of our entities used NDAs. I've tried to do some calling and find out from some people that were employed prior to the GCR if that was the common practice, and I can't find anybody who says it is. It may have been practiced in some cases, but normally NDAs are used. Well, I give you an illustration. My son works for a technology type company as a mechanical engineer, so he had to sign an NDA when he joined. And when he leaves, saying that he can't take their proprietary information and give it to somebody or use it. It's proprietary. But I would think as a Christian organization, we would want people to be able to speak freely. We need that to be healthy. What are some of the things that you've seen? What's your perspective on the use of NDAs in our entities now?
Yeah, I've sometimes said Southern Baptists believe in freedom of speech until freedom of speech is turned upon us, or freedom of the press. But I think NDAs as a standard practice should have no place in Baptist life. There are examples, as you said, if you're protecting proprietary information, which we really don't deal with. We're not software developers. We're dealing with ministry, and often NDAs are intended to prevent embarrassing information. A former staff member going out and saying something, revealing something perhaps that might be embarrassing. And sometimes leaders will say that they're protecting the organization through the use of NDAs so that people aren't spreading embarrassing information. What I've said is the truth is the truth. And if it's true, it's true. If it's not true, it's not true. If someone is spreading falsehoods, then you with the truth. But you don't prevent people from telling the truth. And Baptists, again, have a right to know. Our churches have a right to know. I think most people, I'll bet many who are on tonight, really did not know that we are in the kind of decline that we're in. Probably didn't know that we're planting fewer churches than we have in 40 to 50 years, or baptizing fewer people than we have in over 80 years. Cooperative program giving in 2007 was $85 million more than it was last year. People don't know that. Why don't they know that? Because it's not information that is encouraging, some would say. But I think what it is, it's true, and it teaches us something. Maybe it tells us that Southern Baptists, some Southern Baptists don't like what we're doing. Now, here's something that I just think is alarming. We have over 5,000 fewer churches supporting missions through the cooperative program than we did in 2007. Now, that's a number that ought to sink in. Over 5,000 fewer churches that support the cooperative program than did in 2007. The question is why? Well, I would say maybe people don't like some of what we're doing. Maybe the GCR didn't work. I think the GCR is responsible for a lot of the fall off in the numbers of churches supporting us, and other things are as well. But I think the truth is always helpful because it teaches us something and it enables us to make changes. If we don't know reality, then we can't make the proper changes and the necessary adjustments to help us do better. We have to deal in reality. And so if NDAs protect Southern Baptists from reality, they're not a good thing.
Yeah.
By the way, I've never signed an NDA, and I've never asked anyone to sign an NDA.
Yeah, I think to be healthy, any organization needs to hear what's wrong. And you need to hear, it's kind of like, it's fairly common in a lot of organizations, but when somebody leaves the organization, you have an exit interview, right? And and you want to know, are you leaving because of mismanagement? Your superior? I mean, we want to know. And even within the organization, there needs to be healthy conversation, even if it's alarming and doesn't reflect well. You need to know that to make the adequate corrections. Look, one of the things that's really come to the surface here, it started a couple of years back, actually, at our convention, and there was a resolution passed. Everybody just refers to it now as Resolution 9 because they know it's a resolution that deals with critical race theory. There have been a number of people that I have seen and heard that are fearing that the Southern Baptist Convention is drifting toward wokeism or drifting liberal in that. And there was such a push, obviously back during what's called the conservative resurgence, to get back to the Bible, get back to saying, hey, the Bible is sufficient, the Bible is adequate. What is your view on what's happened around we're not going to try to unpack all of Resolution 9. I'm not asking you to do that, but what is your view about that, and what can be done in the future? Because now a lot of people understand better what critical race theory is and its impact. What can we do, and how can you influence that as a presidential candidate?
Well, I think Resolution 9, there were some obvious problems with that, one of which was Most of the messengers on the floor, I think, didn't know what they were voting on. It's never a good idea to vote on something that the average Southern Baptist doesn't have a clue about. And I think very few understood what critical race theory and intersectionality are all about. The other thing is, there were only a few thousand churches represented in Birmingham when Resolution 9 passed. If we empower our churches to participate through remote location voting, if we can have 10,000 or 20,000 more churches involved in the annual meeting, I don't think a resolution like number 9 would pass if we empowered our churches to have greater input into things like that. I think anytime we try to make decisions outside of Scripture, or we try to formulate policy outside of Scripture, we're on bad ground. Baptists are a people of the book, or at least we like to tell ourselves we're a people of the book. The Bible has the answers. The Bible doesn't come with an expiration date. It doesn't matter what issues we're dealing with today or tomorrow. The Bible is current and relevant to today's issues. And so I think whenever we try to debate whether or not we agree with this theory or that theory, outside of what Scripture clearly teaches, we're on bad and shaky ground. The Bible tells us everything we need to know about human nature, about the commonality of man, that all humankind is made in the image and likeness of God, that Jesus died for every single person who would trust him through faith, that we are not to be a respecter of persons, that the Jew and the Gentile both can come to faith in Christ, that in Jesus, it's level at the foot of the cross, and there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile. So I think we should stick with Scripture when dealing with the great issues of the day, because the Bible teaches us how to love our neighbor. The Bible teaches us how to love our enemies. And we don't need a secular theory, which, by the way, categorizes people not based on character or based on faith, but categorizes people based on skin color or sexual identity. I just don't think that's helpful in any way. In fact, I think it's anti-biblical. It's not what the Scripture teaches. The Scripture teaches that we're individually accountable, that we're all sinners by nature and by choice, and that we're accountable to God individually for our obedience and our faith. We're not accountable as a group. And as a group, we are not declared sinful, unless you're talking about the group being the group of humanity, the whole of the human race, which are born with the sin nature. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of issues. And as a president, one thing I would instruct the resolution committee to do is to speak to those issues that the Baptist Faith and Message clearly speaks to, that Southern Baptists have clearly addressed and spoken to, and not to get into areas of controversy which maybe they're of interest to some, but they're not helpful to the mission of God. We were formed as a missionary people. We were formed to advance the mission of God. And I think getting distracted by things like that does us no favor in terms of advancing the mission of God. Instead, it destroys trust. And when trust is destroyed, we don't unite together.
Right. Well, I've gotten word that we have some questions that are being submitted, a number of questions, and Pastor Starkey is working through those and getting some that are representative of the group. So I'm giving Pastor Starkey a warning. I want to ask you one more question, Randy Adams, and then we're going to go to some viewer questions as they're coming in. But let me ask you one more thing. After being ruled against by the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, the North American Mission Board has taken the case of Dr. Will McRaney to the Supreme Court now. You've said that if the North American Mission Board were to win, and that obviously the Supreme Court have to accept the case first, but if it were accepted and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the North American Mission Board, then it could potentially jeopardize basically all Southern Baptists, all Southern Baptist churches, all of our entities. Tell us how so.
Well, the North American Mission Board has argued that they have absolute rights and privileges over state conventions, and that they have a right to interfere in our work if they choose. and which begs the question. Dr. McCraney was not an employee of the North American Mission Board. He was an employee of the Maryland-Delaware Baptist Convention. And therefore, the North American Mission Board had no right to interfere with his employment. They're arguing that they could if they had chosen to do so. Also, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission filed an amicus brief in which they said that Southern Baptists are a hierarchy, and that the SBC National is the umbrella organization over all churches. Get that. All of our churches, the SBC is the umbrella, is at the top of the pyramid, in other words, over churches, associations, and state conventions. Now, that was an extremely dangerous amicus brief in which to file. Every Baptist from age 6 on up practically knows we're not a hierarchy. Every church is autonomous. Every association, every convention is autonomous. But that was argued in that case. Well, NAMB, their argument is I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the legalities of it, but when they say that they're a supporting organization of a state convention which gives them the right to interfere, that means that they have the right maybe not just to interfere with the state convention, but to interfere with the church. If there is a hierarchy in the Southern Baptist Convention, it can create ascending and descending liability, so that if a church does something wrong, maybe the church, this part of the SBC, could be held responsible. Or if a church does wrong, the association or the convention could be held legally responsible. Now, in the filing,
all these abuse cases, right? All these abuse cases we've seen that have been, like the Houston Chronicle published some things on that, and that would create what they call the descending liability, that everybody connected, if they are truly an umbrella, or we have a hierarchical type of an organization. So let's get into that maybe a little bit more in a minute, Randy, but I do want to open our lines up. We've got a number of questions, so I don't want to back that up too much, and then I may come back and follow up with a few things now. But let me turn it over to Randy Starkey, and Randy, if you'll get us started with some questions from our viewers.
Randy, we have several questions coming in. I'm losing my voice here. Just a reminder to those who are posting questions, unless you click the link in the description of this feed, there's a link there to give permissions. It's not going to show your name otherwise, but we still have your questions. So I'm going to start, let's see here. I had it here. I'm sorry. I lost my question that I was getting ready to post. This is, I don't have the name to this one, but here's one. Since the president is not a member of the executive committee and the executive committee controls the entities, how do you plan to fix the GCR, NAMB, and associational broken partnerships?
Well, there are different ways to do that. The GCR was actually created by the president. He put together a task force which brought a recommendation to the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention voted on the recommendation of a presidential task force. So the president does have that prerogative. The president also has a bully pulpit. He has influence and can speak to various issues. I think if the president called upon the North American Mission Board or Lifeway Christian Resources to have an independent forensic financial audit, for example, I think there would be influence behind that, and there would be weight behind that. I think there's every reason for us to ask for the books to be opened and for us to be made aware of how the money is being spent. I think that's a very reasonable request. And I think when the president makes that request, then that request carries much more weight, because the media will now, and the focus of that question, becomes much greater, much weightier when the president makes a request like that. Obviously, the president also makes appointments, trustee appointments, so you can begin to change the makeup of the board of the various entities. One of the things I'm advocating is we need trustees. We need to appoint trustees that understand they represent the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention to these entities. They don't, first of all, represent the entity back to the churches or the president of the entity back to the churches. We need to train our trustees independently from the training that the entities give them so that they understand they are trusted to hold the entity accountable to the governing documents of the SBC and the entity leader accountable to the governing documents of the SBC. We have entities in violation of governing documents. And that just should not be. But the trustees are not holding them accountable. So that would be one thing I would press hard, is independent trustee training, perhaps creating a resource for trustees who feel like they're being marginalized or the board is not following the bylaws of the SBC. So, for example, I mentioned the former chairman of Lifeway's board. He's still a board member of Lifeway, though he is clearly in violation of SBC bylaws.
All right,
okay,
thank you,
very
Randy.
good. Thank you, Randy. Yep, go ahead, Randy.
Another
Pastor
question.
Starkey.
This is coming from Zachary Minton. He says, is there a way to get the names of churches that we are supporting through NAMB?
That's a great question, Zach. The answer to that question is those names have not been provided. It used to be every state convention would have a list of those churches because they would be funded through the state convention. So NAMB would send the funds to the state convention. The state convention would match those dollars at a certain percentage and send the fund to the church plant. So every state convention would know who in their state convention is receiving money, how much money they're receiving. That's no longer the case. Now, new church plants are receiving their funding through supporting churches. So it's really difficult, even for state conventions, let alone for us to get a national number or a national listing of all the church plants. It's difficult to do. So I think, however, transparency demands that should happen. We should know how many churches are being funded, and we should know the names of those churches. The other thing is, just from a practical standpoint, when we start churches, those churches are going to have a long-term relationship, we hope and pray, with their sister churches in their own association and in their own state convention. They're not going to be funded church plants forever. They're going to be funded for 3, 4, 5 years max. But hopefully those churches will last for 10, 20, 30, 100 years or till Jesus comes. And so I think it's a big mistake to give control of church planting to a national entity. I think everything is kept more healthy if it's kept local, if the funding is kept local. And by the way, when troubles happen in a church or in a church plant, traditionally it's been at the associational level that we've dealt with some of those theological issues because we know each other at the associational level. We have personal relationships. We hear about what's going on in the church across town, for example, at the associational level. And then even at the state convention level, we're going to know more than we will at the national level. So I definitely think that we should know every church that's receiving funding from Southern Baptist, because this isn't NAMB's money. This is money entrusted to Southern Baptists by the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. This is a ministry of the churches, not a ministry of an entity.
Here's a good question, I think. How do you plan to fight the ungracious interactions that seem to be dominating the SBC right now?
Well, that is true. There's a lot of ungracious actions. I think social media probably exacerbates that. Whenever you have a low level of trust, which happens when you don't have transparency. You know, if we have transparency and we know what's going on, we may not agree with each other, but at least we know we're being honest with each other. When there's secrecy and a lack of transparency, it lowers trust. Maybe what's happening is good, maybe it's not, but we just don't know. And it creates an environment where there's maybe more rancor. The other thing is we are so easily distracted by sideshows, some of which are important. They're not unimportant, but they have taken us away from the mission of God. Southern Baptists were formed for one purpose, and that is to advance the Great Commission locally, throughout North America and around the world. And anything that distracts us from advancing the mission of God, advancing the Great Commission, it's a tragedy. And whenever we get distracted from that advancing of the mission and working cooperatively together to do it, it harms us. It harms us relationally. It harms us cooperatively. I believe it's why our churches, over 5,000 churches are no longer giving through the cooperative program, a net decrease of over 5,000. And it's why we're giving tens of millions fewer dollars than we did a decade ago. It's tragic. By the way, what that means is we have 2,000 fewer international missionaries on the field. 2,000 fewer international missionaries because of the drop in giving. Not to mention fewer church plants, not to mention baptisms that are at Great Depression levels. I mean, it is tragic. We are not making disciples like we once did. I believe we can get back to that, but we need to have a transformation in how we do our work. Transparency, accountability, bringing churches in through participation. That's the way that we transform our work, build back trust, so that we can work together again and cooperate together again.
I just mentioned about not equal gifts but equal sacrifice. That has been a theme really for many Southern Baptists for many years. The origin of the cooperative program was the idea that every church, large or small, if they all gave 10% of their budget, then the money dollar amounts was going to be significantly different. But it was equal sacrifice. You were just as much of a part if you were in a big church or a small church. It didn't matter. It was true for everybody. But one of the things that I've heard you speak of is what are called NAMB ambassadors, where the North American Mission Board has selected, I've heard varying numbers, but around 7,000 churches or so. They've assigned these ambassadors, and I don't know a lot about what they do, but are you familiar with that? And how does that help us have a sense that all 47,000 plus of our Southern Baptist churches are actually cared for and loved and respected and valued the same?
Yes, and I've been told the number 7,000 churches by the leader of NAMB. I was told in our convention by our NAMB ambassador, this was 2 or 3 years ago, that he was entrusted with 37 churches in the Northwest Baptist Convention. Now, we have about 500 churches and mission churches, but he had 37 churches. The reason being, they said, those 7,000 churches give 80% of the money. So they're focusing on those 7,000 churches, to which I said, what about the widow's mite? I think Scripture teaches us not equal giving, but equal sacrifice. Scripture teaches us that it's the heart that gives cheerfully that matters most. It's the person who gives their all, though it may be little, but it's the best they can do, and maybe it's all they have, like in the case of the widow's mite. That means something. It means something to God. It ought to mean something to us. In your convention, wherever you are and listening, you have a NAMB ambassador, maybe multiple NAMB ambassadors. They get paid by NAMB to represent NAMB. They get paid to contact these larger giving churches. And they get paid, and usually they're very respected pastors. In fact, probably always are. They're great guys. They're good people, and that's why they were asked to be a NAMB ambassador. But you just need to know they're paid by NAMB to represent NAMB, sometimes to run some interference in the convention for NAMB. I think it's very unfortunate. By the way, it used to be that the partnership between NAMB and the state convention was so tight that the person who represented NAMB in the state was the state executive director. We worked together. We were partners, and we worked together. And we lost that because of the Great Commission Resurgence and how it's been applied by the North American Mission Board. We no longer have a partnership. NAMB is a donor sometimes to our ministry, but we're not a full partner. And much of what they do in all of our conventions, we don't even know anything about. They're done independent of associations and independent of state conventions.
Yeah, that's a great decline. Okay, we're going to go back to another question with Randy. Randy, real quick before I do that, I want to follow up real quick just for clarification, Dr.
Okay.
Adams. You said the largest giving churches. So on that list that the NAMB ambassadors are, cultivating relationships with, that kind of thing. Are these the highest percentage giving churches in our convention? Or are they the largest in dollar amount? In other words, church that may give only 1%, but they're very large. They give, $1 million or something, but another church that gives, well, I pastored a church gave 32.5%, which is just phenomenal.
Right.
But they were a significant church, and you know the church, First Baptist Fletcher. You were in Oklahoma for a while. But which of those two categories are what you refer to when you mean those larger giving churches?
The largest dollar amount. Yeah, it's not the largest percentage. It's the largest dollar amount.
So it's not the equal sacrifice.
Correct. It's not the equal sacrifice. So they want the money from all the other churches, the ones that are below 7,000, but you don't have the same influence. You don't have a seat at the table. There's a Native American saying, I think it's Native American, that says if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I feel that some of our churches may rightly think they're on the menu. They don't have the influence. They're not contacted specifically or particularly by anybody. But we want their money. We don't want their influence, but we want, what we want. And they're sort of on the menu. We want something from you, but we don't want you at the table of decision making. That's why I think
just wanted to clarify,
expanded participation is so important. Yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, going back to Randy Starkey.
All right, Randy, I'm going to frame this next question before I pop it up here because it's a question even I've had. In fact, I read an article recently in our presidential group, and it was a good article. But there's been little word from some of the candidates about their positions on some of these things. And in the article, it's actually stated something about you and Mike Stone aggressively candidating for this. And so I'm just framing that with those ideas. And this was the question here. In your opinion, why do you think Mr. Moeller and Mr. Litton haven't voiced their concerns or opinions about these issues?
Well, I don't know why they haven't. I really can't speak for them. I can tell you the reason I have is because I think you have a right to know. I think Southern Baptists have a right to know. Our churches have a right to know what I would intend to do. And so I want to be as clear as I can, answer every question that's put to me, because you have a right to know what I think and what I would intend to do. And so why they're not addressing the issues, I'm not certain they could answer that. But I know for myself, the other thing is, I feel like if I'm not clear about what I intend to do, I don't have a mandate. I can't go to the entity leaders and say, listen, the reason I was voted for in this position was because Southern Baptists want transparency. They want the bank books open. They want the books open. They want to know, how many church plants are we funding? They want to know that that you represent the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention, not your own personal opinion regarding politics or other things. So that's the reason I'm outspoken about these issues. And some have said it's aggressive campaigning. To me, it's responsible. It's responsible for me to help Southern Baptists know who I am and what I believe.
All right. Let me pull up another question. This one's a little bit, it might not be completely clear, but I think I know what they mean. How do we balance dysfunctional associations with overpowered NAMB? And I think that's really a question to the relationship issue of those those entities.
Well, our associations, and in the South, you may not know this, but associations outside of the South, most of them were jointly funded by the State Convention and by the North American Mission Board. And our associations are much weaker outside the South. Our median church in the Northwest runs 50 on Sunday. So our median church runs 50. In the Southern Baptist Convention, by the way, it's probably 70 to 75. Most of our churches, the normal church in the SBC is well under 100. And so associations are really important for those churches. My first two pastorates, the only representative I knew of the Southern Baptist Convention was my director of missions. I pastored 3 churches for 19 years. My first 2, I didn't know one state convention person in my first 2 churches. I didn't know any national person other than my seminary professors, if you call them national. I knew the director of missions. The director of missions was very helpful to me. In my first church, there were 10 people in that first church. By the way, they were going to close the doors. and they decided to give it one more go, and that was in 1986. That church is still there. About 2 years in, we planted another church. It's very, very exciting. I wanted to pastor both churches. I wanted to pastor this little church, and it was Fairview Baptist Church in Rome, Texas, and I wanted to pastor the church in Newark that we started. My director of missions helped me understand that was a bad idea. And he helped me know how to plant the church and how to go about a search process. And we planted a healthy, successful church in Newark, Texas. And it wasn't the state convention who helped me. It was my director of missions. So I'm a big believer in associational missions. Now, some would say that not every DOM is great. Well, that's true. Just like not every pastor is great, just like not every state exec is great or state leader. However, it's always best and always most healthy if we keep things most local. And the association is most local. NAMB may have skills we don't have at the associational or state levels. They may have abilities, I don't know, but they can't be everywhere. You know, we don't have 10 talented people in every church or every convention or every level of Baptist life. We deal with, most of us are just, we love Jesus and we want to serve Jesus, and we have moderate giftedness. And that's the way the church has been built historically. That's the way the Southern Baptist Convention has been built. We're not built by those who can do everything. We're built by those who can do something. And if you keep things local, so for example, you know, we have in the Northwest, we're not just Seattle and Portland. We have towns of 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000. We have some great churches in those towns. And in those towns, we have a lot of variety. We have towns in Washington State that are more Christian than towns in Texas are, for example, or Oklahoma. We have one town of 750, and the First Baptist Church has 400 on Sunday. There aren't many places in the South that have that. I say that to say you have to have local knowledge. Local knowledge. You can't have that from national headquarters. It's even hard to have that from a state headquarters, by the way. That's why we rely upon the local pastor and the local associational leader. I think from the national level and the state level, we support. Yeah, we need to support and help train and help encourage and resource the people who are local, the boots on the ground.
This one is a little more broad, but I'll put it up here. It's anonymous, but what will be your direction about multi-ethnic plants rather than just our traditional way of planting churches?
Oh, I'm glad for that question. In the Northwest, almost a third of our churches worship in a language other than English. Half of our new church starts are what we would call ethnic, and most of those are non-English. So, for example, we have 41 Korean churches. Korean's our second most common language in the Northwest in our churches. We have 30 Spanish-speaking churches. I preached last Sunday in a Russian church. They had both Russian and English and Russian. We have 19 Russian language churches. We have a dozen Vietnamese language churches. So it's, to me, this week I have been with Vietnamese people. This is only Tuesday. So Sunday I was with Russian people. Yesterday I was with Vietnamese people. To me, our nation is becoming more and more ethnic. And now, these language groups want to migrate to English. So the Russian church, their English language service now has about 180, 200 people. They understand the future in the next decade or 20 or 30 years, they're going to be an English-speaking congregation, maybe a very small Russian-speaking congregation. But they're still going to be culturally distinct in certain ways. So I think ethnic churches of a different language, of a different culture are huge in our. We have about, I think, 10,000, 12,000 Southern Baptist churches that are ethnically not Anglo. And many of those worship in a language other than English.
You had opened the door about the associational relationship, and North American Mission Board can't be everywhere, but they often did that through partnering with local associations and state convention. Just a question of your availability. Are you open and available to be able to speak to groups, like associational groups, groups of pastors, others, whether it be via, a Zoom call or some other way of communicating like that? Do you have that availability?
Absolutely. I'm scheduling associational Zoom type meetings right now, and I'd love to do that with your association. And I'll answer every question as best I can. to whomever asks it, and nothing to me is out of bounds or off limits. So I would love for those opportunities.
That's great. Okay, so they can contact you through your website. I know that's a possible way, or through Facebook, even the Facebook group. Okay, Pastor
Correct.
Starkey.
Okay, well, this is kind of, I mean, there's other questions. And of course, Randy, you can go back and look at this feed and answer some of the more specific questions. Most of them were around some of the things that you've already discussed. But here's one I thought's a good one, and this is going to be the last one I'm going to put up on the screen tonight. And I think it's a good one for us to finish up with. And it says from Danny Daniel, it says, thanks for sharing tonight. How are you involved in your local church, and how are you personally involved in discipleship outside of your associational role?
Oh, that's a great question, Danny. I'm an elder in a church plant. So we started a new church. I live in Ridgefield, Washington, and we started a new church 3 years ago. It's going wonderfully well, by the way. Go Church. And really, I have kind of a mentoring relationship with our pastor. He's a great pastor, does a great job, but he's one I could say I have advisory role with, and maybe in some sense a mentoring role with. But my wife is the treasurer for the church. We're as involved as we can be. As a state exec, I have to be in a lot of churches. We have, as I said, about 500 churches. So I preach in all kinds of different churches virtually every week. I try to make sure I'm in my own church at least every couple of months. And of course, this past year with COVID, I was there a lot more often than I often would be. But that's pretty typical of our role. It's important to me. It doesn't matter how far the church is from where I live, how big or how small. If I'm available, I say yes to our churches. If they want me to come and speak or come and meet with them, I do that. So in terms of mentoring, a lot of my work has to do with local church pastors. I'm meeting with a church planter in a couple of weeks. And then again, I meet periodically with my pastor. I'm often taking calls, advising pastors on just various issues. Of course, this year, a lot of it was how to handle some of the social distancing and how to handle disagreements in the church, and just a variety of issues like that. So much of what I do is addressing specific concerns that churches and pastors have. And so I kind of see myself as a pastor to pastors at this point. I was a senior pastor for 19 years in the local church. I've been an interim pastor of 9 churches, by the way, helping them transition to the next pastor. So much of my work now is working with pastors.
The presidential powers of the SBC president are fairly limited. I mean, you don't have you can't just sweep in and say, well, you can't do like the U.S. president, write executive orders, I guess. Maybe you'd like to do that, but you can't do that. So describe for us first how you feel like you really can make a difference because you can't just sweep in and change all the policy. And as a part of that, maybe help us understand how you see the obstacles you face as a candidate. How are you going to overcome those obstacles?
Sure. Well, you're right. The president doesn't have absolute powers, of course, but I do think we're at a time in Southern Baptist life when we need a president who represents the churches to the SBC and not the SBC back to the churches. In other words, we need a president who's not simply a cheerleader for what Southern Baptists are about, but a president who helps hold accountable our agencies and entities to do the work that Southern Baptists have charged them to do, and to hold them accountable for poor performance. As I've said, I think the GCR has not done us well, and I think we're in a season of very poor performance. The worst decade in the 175-year history of the Southern Baptist Convention is the last decade in terms of decline. That is tragic to me because I love Southern Baptists. I became a Southern Baptist because of the cooperative work of Southern Baptists. So I want to see our cooperative work grow. I want to see our effectiveness in the mission grow. But I think at this point, the way that happens is not through rebranding who we are. It's not a slick marketing campaign. It's not asking people to give more money. It's creating a transparent environment that builds trust back into the system. It's holding our entities and our leaders accountable to what they say they'll do so that we can stop corruption in the SBC. It's bringing more churches into the system. You know, one of the things that people that I've mentioned earlier that people probably did not know is that 5,000 fewer churches support the cooperative program than did in 2007. That's one of the most striking numbers I think we could ever imagine when we're looking at our decline. I want to bring those churches back in. I wonder, why did they drop out? I think we ought to know that. And how do we bring them back in? And how do we keep our churches engaged and believing in who we are as Southern Baptists? That's what I want to be about as a president. In terms of challenges, you know, I did not seek this position. I really came to believe that God wanted me to do this because I felt I'm in a position to see things that maybe I wasn't when I was a local church pastor, working at the associational level, working at the state convention level, working with the International Mission Board. I've been all over the world in mission partnerships, helped start a number of mission partnerships, love the IMB. My parents were IMB missionaries for 12 or 13 years later in life. There's a whole story there. But I love who we are as Southern Baptists, and it grieves me that we're not as effective as I believe we can be. And so that's why I'm doing this. It's not about resume. It's not about, you know, having a position. It's about trying to make a difference, And so what that means is if someone does not like what I do or like me because of something I do, that's all right. Because I feel a responsibility to the churches, not to the leader of an entity. I feel a responsibility to letting the truth be known, because if revealing the truth is not good for you, you're on the wrong side of the truth. We ought not fear the truth. We ought not fear the brutal, hard facts, whatever they might be. If we know the truth, then we can adjust and we can learn and we can change according to what the truth tells us. So that's really what I'm about. It's what I was about as a pastor from my very first pastorate, in state convention work, working with the missions and evangelism team for Oklahoma Baptist, working with Northwest Baptist. It's always been about how do we expand our missional impact? How do we expand the missionary impact of who we are? How do we serve our churches well? All of our churches, big and small. And my first church, as I said, there were 10 people when I got there. They were retired. But we saw in that church a possibility. And sometimes a church can get down to where they're almost dead. But if you can help them survive and help them find a reason to survive, which, by the way, I say, if you can get a church to look up and look out, look up to the Lord in prayer, look up to the Lord through His Word, teach a church kingdom praying, to pray for the missionaries, to pray for the lost in the community, engage God in the community through prayer. And then if you can get the church to look out at the world and look out at who needs Jesus, that is the path to revitalizing a church. And so that little church of 10 survived. And we never became big. We were about 35 when I left that church 3.5 years later. We never became, but they're still there. And they have a mission impact. And several Southern Baptist leaders, by the way, interestingly, their first pastorate was that church. There were 3 guys that came after me that I've kept up with. One is a seminary professor, one is a state leader in a state convention in the South, and another is a leading pastor in the South, all from that little church. And so when I see a little struggling church, I think about, what could this church be? What could God do through this church in reaching 1 or 2 or 3 people a year, even perhaps, in helping a young pastor like I was to learn how to preach, to learn how to make a hospital visit? Our churches have a purpose. Whether they're massive or whether they're very, very small, they have a purpose. And we don't always know what that purpose is, but God does know. And so as a president of the Southern Baptist Convention, as a state exec, in whatever ministry I have, I'm all about seeking the opportunities for God's people to expand their mission impact in their own community and around the world. And the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention will just give me a larger platform in which to do that.
Okay, Randy, I want to do this in wrapping up in just a couple of sentences. Wrap up what you want people to know about Randy Adams and the SBC presidency.
Well, I'm a person who became a Southern Baptist because of the mission work of Southern Baptists. I grew up in a town that didn't have a Southern Baptist church, Whitefish, Montana. It does now. It didn't then. But Southern Baptist had a Christian group on my college campus, the Baptist Student Union. It was the only Christian group on campus. And it's how I learned about the value of cooperation. It's what brought me into, it changed my life, because I'm not an engineer today. I'm a preacher, and that happened through the work of the BSU and the local Baptist church, Floral Park Baptist Church of Butte, Montana, that I joined. And then Southwestern Seminary. And Southern Baptist helped educate me, both an MDiv and a PhD through Southwestern Seminary. And I have a great debt that I owe to Southern Baptist for that education. And then all of our churches, most of our churches and most of what we have are inherited. For example, our mission boards, our seminaries, a lot of our churches, we didn't build those. We hopefully will steward those well so that we pass on to the next generation something more than what we received. But we're stewards. We are inheritors of a great trust. That's the way I see myself. I don't want to be a Hezekiah. In Isaiah chapter 39, when Hezekiah was told that everything he and his forefathers had built up would be carried off to Babylon one day, and everything would be over, and Hezekiah's response was, "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," for he thought, "There will be peace and security in my lifetime." I don't want to be a Hezekiah. I don't want to just be glad I don't have to see the downfall when it comes. I want to be a part of stewarding well the inheritance that we have received. And when I see the inheritance that our forefathers gave us squandered and frittered away and misused, it grieves me, it upsets me sometimes, and because I think it's disrespectful. It's disrespectful to our forefathers. It's disrespectful to those who come after us. I try to think not about this year or even next year, but 2030 and 2040. Where will we be in 2030 and 2040? If we don't transform the Southern Baptist Convention, if we continue on the path of decline we're on right now, we are going to be a fraction in 2040 of what we are today. But that doesn't have to happen. That doesn't have to happen. If we expand the system and involve more churches in the system, if we create transparency in our finances and our performance, if we hold ourselves accountable and our leaders accountable to what we've determined to do to advance the mission of God, I believe we can have a better future than we had in the past. But I don't believe it's inevitable. It is inevitable that God will accomplish his mission. It's not inevitable that God will do it through us. But I want God to do it through us. That's the question. Yeah. Will God accomplish his mission in an increasing way through Southern Baptists or not? I think that's the question we face. It's always the question we face as leaders in our Baptist work. And that's what motivates me, and that's what causes me to think in the ways that I do.
Very good. Thank you, Randy, for being with us tonight. We thank you for taking the time and answering questions about what you see as the future of the Southern Baptist Convention and what some of our bruises and scrapes and hurts are right now that need to be fixed and repaired and healed. So we're going to be doing these kind of interviews with the other candidates that are willing to do it. We already have Mike Stone scheduled. He's going to do an interview with our group on the 1st of April, so it'll be at 8 o'clock Eastern time again as well. So just plan on being a part of that when we do that. So for our SBC 21 Presidential Nominees Facebook group, I'm Bobby Gilstrap. We're glad you joined us tonight for this interview with Randy Adams. We hope it was helpful to you and the future. Thank you again for being with us.